The year was 1933, and the United States desperately needed to believe in the future. The Great Depression had devastated the economy. Millions of people were out of work. Bread lines stretched down the streets. The country was searching for hope, something that would prove better days were still possible. And then a man appeared with a vision so radical, so ahead of its time, that it seemed taken from the pages of a science fiction novel. His name was Richard Buckminster Fuller, but the world would know him as Bucky. He was an architect, inventor, visionary, a man who thought in complete systems instead of partial solutions. He had designed revolutionary, prefabricated houses, theorized about floating cities, dreamed of transforming how humanity lived, moved, and existed. But in 1933, his obsession was the automobile. Fuller looked at the cars of his era and saw inefficiency everywhere. They were heavy metal boxes that wasted fuel, caught the wind, moved clumsily through the streets. They were relics of an earlier era, barely evolved since the first horseless carriages. Why, Fuller asked himself, didn't cars take advantage of everything we had learned about aerodynamics from airplanes? Why did they have to be so heavy, so inefficient, so obsolete? He decided he would build the car of the future, and he would call it the Dymaxion. But to Fuller, it wasn't really a car. He saw it as the ground taxiing phase of a larger transportation dream, a vehicle that could one day drive through city streets, take off like an aircraft, land, and keep moving on the road. The name Dymaxion was coined by Waldo Warren, a Marshall Fields wordsmith, for the Dymaxion House exhibit. And Fuller later adopted it as his signature label, blending dynamic, maximum, and tension. What he created was something nobody had seen before. And Fuller wasn't working alone. He teamed up with Starling Burgess, a renowned naval architect who understood sleek, stable forms. And the project is also linked to Isamu Noguchi, the sculptor-designer whose eye for shape and flow matched the Dymaxion's futuristic soul. This wasn't a random experiment. It was a serious, cross-disciplinary attempt to redesign motion itself. The Dymaxion looked like no automobile on the streets. It was long, about 20 feet, but incredibly aerodynamic, with a teardrop shape that recalled a dirigible or a giant fish. The front was wide and rounded, gradually tapering toward the rear, where a single wheel provided steering. Yes, a single rear wheel. The Dymaxion had 3 wheels total, 2 in front for traction and stability, a single wheel in back that turned to steer. Even more unconventional, it used a rear-mounted Ford flathead Vi-8, about 85 horsepower driving the front wheels. It was a radically different configuration from any conventional 4-wheeled car. The body was aluminum over an ash frame and lightweight structure, keeping weight down while maximizing strength. The windows were large, providing panoramic visibility. Original blueprints indicate seating for 4, including the driver, though Fuller sometimes promoted much higher passenger counts, claiming it could carry up to 11. But what was truly revolutionary was the performance. Fuller claimed the Dymaxion could reach up to 120 miles per hour, though later accounts often cite top speeds closer to 90. He also claimed roughly 30 miles per gallon, sometimes more, far better than many conventional cars of the era. How? Pure aerodynamics. The teardrop shape cut through the air instead of pushing it. It reduced drag dramatically. It was like comparing a modern airplane to a brick box. And it could turn in an incredibly tight radius. But that rear wheel steering also made it tricky at speed, and Fuller reportedly restricted who was allowed to drive it. That rear wheel, which handled steering, allowed the Dymaxion to practically turn on itself, making maneuvers that conventional cars could not dream of performing. And here's the wild part. This wasn't backed by Detroit, a giant corporation, or a government contract. Fuller pushed it forward with donations and even family inheritance money, trying to fund a transportation revolution on belief, charisma, and sheer nerve. Fuller built it in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in an industrial building, the former Locomobile Dynamometer building, with a team of about 27 workers, including experienced mechanics, but without the resources of a major automotive manufacturer. Each Dymaxion was essentially handmade, a masterpiece of engineering and craftsmanship. When the first prototype was complete, Fuller presented it to the public in July of 1933. The reaction was explosive. Newspapers published photos on front pages. Magazines called it the car of the future. Crowds gathered wherever Fuller drove the Dymaxion through the streets of New York or Chicago. People stopped, pointed, were left speechless. It seemed impossible. It seemed as if someone had brought a vehicle from the year 2000 back to 1933. The design was so radically different, so futuristic, that it captured the imagination of everyone who saw it. Fuller was a natural showman. He drove the Dymaxion in public exhibitions, demonstrating its maneuverability, its speed, its efficiency. He explained his design philosophy in interviews, talking about how the Dymaxion was just the beginning, how eventually these machines could even fly, combining ground and air transportation. The media ate up every word. In the middle of the Depression, with so little positive news, the Dymaxion represented hope, innovation, and the promise that America could still create amazing things. Celebrities wanted to be photographed with it. Industrialists expressed interest. Investors began asking questions. Could this be mass-produced? Could the Dymaxion really replace conventional cars? Fuller would eventually build 3 prototypes, Prototype 1, then Prototypes 2 and 3, each refining the concept and testing how far the idea could go. Everything seemed possible. The future of transportation seemed within reach. And then, in a single terrible moment, it all collapsed. The crash shattered the momentum, but it didn't end the work instantly. Fuller kept pushing forward, and 2 more prototypes would still be built after the October tragedy. But the spell was broken, the money was spooked, and by 1934, the Dymaxion's path to mass production was effectively over. It was October 27, 1933. The Chicago World's Fair, officially called Century of Progress, was in full swing, celebrating a century of American technological advancement. Dymaxion prototype number 1 was being driven near the fairgrounds, piloted by Fuller's own test driver, Francis T. Turner. Turner was killed, and passengers, including William Sempill and Charles Dolphus, were seriously injured. The exact details of what happened next have been disputed for decades, but the basic facts are clear and tragic. At an intersection near the fairgrounds, Dymaxion prototype number 1 rolled over. The vehicle rolled violently, throwing some passengers out, trapping others inside. The metal twisted, glass shattered. Witnesses ran to help. When rescue teams arrived, they found a devastating scene. Francis Turner, the driver, was dead. His passengers, William Sempill and Charles Dolphus, were seriously injured. The beautiful car of the future was badly damaged, a twisted ruin of aluminum and steel, barely recognizable as the elegant vehicle that had captured America's imagination. It was later repaired, but the reputation damage was permanent. The news spread instantly. The newspapers that had celebrated the Dymaxion now published somber headlines about its fatal accident. Photos showed the wreckage, the victims being removed, the disaster scene, and the question on everyone's mind was simple and lethal. Was the Dymaxion inherently unsafe? Buckminster Fuller insisted, until the day of his death, that the accident was not the Dymaxion's fault. He argued that another vehicle had struck the Dymaxion, causing the rollover. Eyewitnesses offered contradictory accounts. Some said they had seen another car involved. Others reported no other vehicle. Official inquiries never pinned down a single uncontested cause. Had it been an external impact, a driver error, a design flaw in the Dymaxion itself? Fuller suspected something darker. He believed that the established automotive industry, fearful of his disruptive innovation, might have been involved. He hinted at sabotage, a conspiracy to destroy the Dymaxion before it could threaten Detroit's status quo. There is no solid evidence of conspiracy. But what is undeniable is that the other vehicle supposedly involved in the accident disappeared from the scene before authorities could document it. A coroner's inquest did not assign fault and described a collision with a car driven by Meyer Roth. Fuller later blamed Roth, though accounts differed on when the other car struck. The mystery was never solved, and in the absence of clear answers, the public narrative established itself quickly. The Dymaxion was dangerous. The transformation in public opinion was brutal and swift. The The same newspapers that had published glowing articles about the car of the future now published editorials questioning its safety. Experts who had never examined the vehicle speculated about inherent design flaws. The three-wheel design was attacked as inherently unstable. Critics argued that any car with a single rear wheel was prone to rolling over. The aerodynamic configuration was dismissed as impractical, too different from proven conventional cars. Investors who had expressed interest disappeared. Celebrities stopped wanting to be associated with the project. Industrialists who had considered mass production backed away. Fuller tried to defend himself. He explained the engineering. He presented performance data. He argued that thousands of miles of testing had proven the Dymaxion was safe when operated correctly. But nobody wanted to listen. One driver had died. That was the only statistic that mattered to the terrified public. The press was relentless. Every article about the Dymaxion now mentioned the fatal accident in the first or second paragraph. The machine of the future had become the machine of death. Fuller continued working on the design. He made modifications, tried to improve stability, considered adding a fourth wheel, but the damage was already done. The Dymaxion was permanently marked in the public consciousness as dangerous, reckless, a failed experiment. In the months following the accident, Fuller desperately struggled to keep the Dymaxion project alive. He sought new investors. He proposed new designs. He tried to change the narrative. But in 1933, in the middle of the Depression, with extremely limited financial resources, and with the project's reputation shattered, it was an impossible battle. The prototype survived for a time, changing hands after the project collapsed. But today, only Dymaxion Prototype 2 remains, preserved in the Hara collection of the National Automobile Museum in Reno, Nevada. Prototype 1 was repaired and sold, but later destroyed in a garage fire. Prototype 3 eventually disappeared and is generally believed to have been scrapped in the 1950s. Fuller occasionally drove them, showed them to those who were still interested. But there was never a number 4. There was never mass production. There was never the transportation revolution that Fuller had imagined. The car of the future became a footnote in history, a curiosity, a what-if, discussed by design historians but unknown to the general public. Buckminster Fuller moved on to other projects. He is more famous today for inventing the geodesic dome, a revolutionary architectural structure used worldwide. He wrote books, gave lectures, became a counterculture figure in the 60s and 70s, celebrated as a visionary who thought in terms of complete systems. But the Dymaxion remained as a wound, a reminder of how radical innovation can be destroyed not by its inherent flaws, but by circumstances, timing, and public reaction. More than 90 years later, the mystery remains. Did the Dymaxion die from an inevitable design error, or from how the world reacted when the future failed in public? Fuller's defenders argue that the design was fundamentally sound. They point to the thousands of successful miles of testing before the accident. They note that the accident involved questionable circumstances, possibly including another vehicle. They suggest that with more development, more refinement, the Dymaxion could have overcome any initial problems. Critics argue that the three-wheel design was inherently problematic, that the high center of gravity combined with the single rear wheel created instability, that Fuller was a brilliant visionary, but not an experienced automotive engineer, that the accident revealed real flaws that eventually would have caused more problems. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The Dymaxion probably had real engineering challenges that would have required additional work to resolve, but it is also true that all new cars have initial problems, that innovation requires iteration, that abandoning a design after a single accident under mysterious circumstances seems premature. What is undeniable is that the public reaction was disproportionate. Conventional cars of 1933 killed thousands of people every year. Accidents were common, but those cars were familiar, accepted. The Dymaxion was different, strange, and when it failed, even once, the world decided it was too dangerous to exist. The story of the Dymaxion teaches an uncomfortable lesson about innovation and public acceptance. It is not enough to have a brilliant idea. It is not enough to build something technically superior. If it is too different, too radical, too ahead of its time, it can be destroyed by a single failure in a way that established technologies never would be. Conventional four-wheeled cars had accidents constantly, but each accident was just an accident. not a verdict on the entire concept of the automobile. The Dymaxion had one accident under questionable circumstances, and it was enough to kill the entire project. It is the price of being first, of being different, of challenging the status quo. You are not allowed to fail. You are not given the benefit of the doubt. One mistake, and you are finished. Fuller understood this painfully. Years later, he reflected on the Dymaxion with a mixture of pride for what he had achieved and sadness for what might have been. He knew he had created something special, something truly innovative, and he knew that circumstances, both of the accident and of the reaction, had killed his dream. Today, when you look at modern automotive designs, you see echoes of the Dymaxion. Aerodynamics is now fundamental. Hybrid and electric cars prioritize efficiency. Three-wheel designs have reappeared in prototypes and concept vehicles. Fuller's ideas were correct. They were just 90 years ahead. Only one original Dymaxion survives today, Prototype 2, while the others were destroyed or lost. Only photographs and documents remain. Some enthusiasts have built replicas based on those photos, trying to recapture something of the spirit of the original. And the question remains resonating through the decades. What would have happened if the accident had never occurred? Or if it had occurred, but the public reaction had been more measured? Would we be driving Dymaxions today? Would Fuller's design have transformed personal transportation? Or was the project doomed anyway? A beautiful but impractical dream that eventually would have failed for economic or technical reasons? The Dymaxion was mortally wounded in 1933, and by 1934, the dream was effectively finished. Buckminster Fuller built a car that was decades ahead of its time. It was faster, more efficient, more innovative than anything on the roads. And a single moment of tragedy under mysterious circumstances destroyed everything he had built. Was it a design flaw? Was it sabotage? Was it simply bad luck at the worst possible moment? We will never know for certain. But what we do know is that the world was not ready for the Dymaxion. It was not ready for something so radically different. And when that something different failed, even once, even under questionable circumstances, the world rejected it completely. Francis Turner died in that accident, and his passengers were seriously injured. But the Dymaxion also died that day, and with it died a vision of how the future of transportation might have been. All that remains is the question, did it die from an inevitable error, or from how we reacted when the future failed us? The answer, uncomfortable and revealing, is probably both. The Dymaxion might have had real problems. But we never had the chance to find out, to solve them, to see if the dream could have become reality. Because after the accident, after the headlines, after the public panic, nobody wanted to give the future a second chance. And so the most advanced car of 1933 disappeared into history, remembered only as the brilliant experiment that failed too publicly to survive.